When it comes to the food that was served to astronauts in those early days of space travel, it was usually things like rehydrated purees in a squeeze tube, gelatinous cubes of bread, and perhaps most famous of all, Tang, the drink of astronauts, which was a popular ingredient to use in Tang pie in the 1960s. So thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video as we look at the history of space food, this time on Tasting History. All right, so I think we are in week 4 of Transportation Month. We've done planes, we've done trains, we've done covered wagons, no automobiles, but today we are transporting ourselves to the moon because we are doing foods that were served in space. Unfortunately, actually cooking foods that are served in space is kind of hard to do because even though the actual recipes themselves might be doable in a home kitchen, the processes that you have to do to actually make them as they would be served in space, you just don't have. You have like industrial equipment to suck out all the air and dehydrate things far more than anything that you could actually get in your home could do. But in the 1960s, people were given the option of trying something that the astronauts actually drank up in space, and that is Tang, made with Tang flavor crystals. Wake up to Tang! Now these came on the market in 1959, having been invented in 1957 by food scientist William Mitchell. And in 1962, NASA sent these flavor crystals up with John Glenn when he went into space so they could be rehydrated and drunk up there. Now because of that, a lot of people thought that Tang was actually developed by NASA, but it wasn't. It was developed by a company called General Foods, but they did nothing to dissuade the fact that people thought that it was an actual NASA product. In fact, they kind of doubled down on it and used it in a lot of their marketing. They even developed a recipe for astronaut pie, or Tang pie, which they marketed as the pie of the future. Spoiler alert, it is not the pie of the future. Not many people eat it these days. But it was very popular in the late 60s, and it helped the company because not only did it use Tang, but it also used a new invention of theirs called Cool Whip. Yum, 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 yum. Comes Whip. Yum, 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 yum.
We can't have pie without Cool Whip.
It was actually also developed by William Mitchell, who also developed a lot of foods during World War II for the troops, including a tapioca-less tapioca, which they called Mitchell Mud, named after him, and he invented Pop Rocks, which I absolutely love. Granted, I haven't had them in like 30 years, but I used to love them. But neither Pop Rocks or Mitchell Mud are in this recipe, which says, mix condensed milk and Tang, add in sour cream until well blended, then fold in tub of Cool Whip. Pour into pie crust and refrigerate for 4 hours or until set and cold. Now it's because it needs to be refrigerated that the pie never actually made it up into space, because in those early days of space travel, they had no way to refrigerate anything. There were no refrigerators, there was no way to heat food. It was just kind of everything was at room temperature or slightly above, I guess. So it really makes you grateful that you have things like a refrigerator and a microwave in your home kitchen, which is really all you need to enjoy a meal from today's sponsor, Factor. Factor is a ready-to-eat meal service that delivers fresh, never-frozen meals right to your door. And similar to HelloFresh, who now owns Factor, the meals are always top-notch, but it's different than HelloFresh because you don't actually even have to cook anything. These meals are perfect for the person who doesn't like to shop, doesn't like to prep, doesn't like to cook, doesn't like to clean up, because all you do is take the meal, pop it in the microwave or into the oven, and in a couple minutes, it's ready. I actually started using Factor years ago before I started Tasting History when I still worked in an office. I would very often bring in Factor meals and heat them up because it was really quick and I didn't have to go out to eat, which got really expensive. They have over 35 chef-crafted meals every week, and they have something to fit every lifestyle, from vegetarian to calorie smart, keto. You can even order extra protein. So to give Factor a try, head over to factor75.com or just click my link in the description and use code TASTINGHISTORY50 to get 50% off of your first box plus 20% off of your next box. That's TASTINGHISTORY50 at factor75.com to get 50% off of your first box and 20% off of your next while the subscription is active. They really are delicious and so easy to prepare, even easier than this Tang pie, which is awful easy to prepare. So for your Tang pie, what you'll need is 1 can of sweetened condensed milk, 3/4 of a cup of Tang powder drink mix, a 1/2 cup of sour cream, 1 9-ounce tub of Cool Whip. Unfortunately, today, I guess due to shrinkflation, Cool Whip doesn't come in a 9-ounce tub anymore. It comes in an 8-ounce tub. So I'm getting 2 and taking an ounce of Cool Whip and adding it to it, but I really don't think it matters. Then you also need 1 graham cracker crust, which you can buy already made, but you can also make it yourself by taking 1.5 cups or 170 grams of graham cracker crumbs and adding 3 tablespoons of brown sugar plus 7 tablespoons or 100 grams of melted butter. Mix all of that together and then press it into the sides and bottom of a 9-inch pie plate. Then pop it in the fridge to firm up a little bit while you make your filling. And for that, all you do is take the sweetened condensed milk and put it in a large bowl, and then stir in the Tang crystals. And this is where the Tang, like magic, turns into a shocking shade of orange. Then add the sour cream and stir it in until smooth. Finally, add the Cool Whip just a bit at a time, folding it in until just combined. You want to make sure you maintain all of that Cool Whip floofiness. Then pour the mixture into the graham cracker crust and smooth it out on top. Then pop it in the fridge for at least 4 hours to let it firm up, and that will give us plenty of time to head back to the 1960s and see what those first people in space were eating for dinner. So while Tang was one of the first foods ever taken up into space, it was not the first, and that's because Tang was for astronauts, but the first person to eat in space was a cosmonaut, or someone who was from the Soviet side. Astronauts were from the American side. On April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to journey into outer space. It was aboard Vostok 1, and during his 108 minutes orbiting the Earth, he ate the very first meal in space, which was beef and liver paste squeezed from a metal tube, followed by a tube of chocolate sauce for dessert. A few months later, cosmonaut German Titov also consumed food in space, shortly afterward becoming the first person to vomit in space. And then it was finally the Americans' turn, not to vomit, but to eat in space. Now, even though the Soviets had already eaten something in space, I guess the conversation was not really happening between them and NASA very much at the time, because NASA was still questioning if people even could eat in space, namely swallowing. You might not be able to get the food to go down without gravity, and so food or water would just kind of sit in your esophagus and you'd drown. But I'm hoping they were pretty sure that that wasn't going to happen, because they told John Glenn Jr., who was the first American to go up into space, that he had to eat and drink something up there. It was on Friendship 7 as he orbited the Earth on February 20th, 1962. And I can confirm that he did not drown. What I'm not entirely sure of is exactly what he drank. Was it water or was it Tang? I know he had Tang very shortly after this, but he might have had it that first time too. I'm not entirely sure. When it comes to food, we do know what he ate because the New York Times wrote about it. Glenn had space snack by tube. Food squeezed via helmet hole. Within about 20 minutes after he had soared aloft, Lieutenant Colonel John H. Glenn Jr. apparently had the first snack in space. The Mercury Control Center here reported that he dipped into his space food at 10:09 as he passed the tracking station at Kano, Nigeria. He squeezed the food out of special tubes resembling oversized tubes of toothpaste. His 2-course menu consisted of a beef-vegetable mixture and applesauce. His squeeze food was semi-solid, which means it was pretty much like baby food, but with adult seasoning and sugar added. Now why, you may ask, is all their food needing to be squeezed from a tube? Well, in 1964, when Scott Carpenter tried to eat cookies on his flight, the crumbs stayed behind to float in front of his face like so many large particles of dust. And the problem with having crumbs up in space is not just that it makes a huge mess, but as The Simpsons showed us.
They'll clog the instruments!
Now, while The Simpsons are famous for predicting future events that then go on to actually happen, in this case, it was the real-life event that preceded The Simpsons. On March 23, 1965, astronaut John Young hid a corned beef sandwich in his spacesuit, and during the mission he pulled it out and offered it to his fellow astronaut, Gus Grissom. Well, upon taking a bite of the sandwich, a bunch of rye crumbs started to float around the cabin. Now Young was like, hey, it's just a prank, bro, but NASA did not see this as a harmless prank, and it actually led to congressional hearings and big ol' hullabaloo, and it led to a bunch of new restrictions on the astronauts about exactly what they could take into space. Now today, instead of bread, they usually just eat tortillas up in space because they don't have crumbs and they have a really long shelf life. But in the 1960s, we were a nation of bread eaters, and so NASA had to figure out a way to come up with a crumbless bread. And they did that by compressing it into bite-sized cubes and then spraying it with a coating of starch, which acted like a gelatin cover. And it wasn't just bread. They made food cubes out of everything from pre-cooked bacon and eggs to cheese and crackers, peanut butter, strawberries, cookies. If you could think of it, NASA could turn it into a little cube that wasn't very good to eat, because usually it was like dehydrated and then compressed into a cube and then packaged, and so when the astronaut would pop it in their mouth, it would rehydrate and they'd eat it, but it was kind of mush and lost its flavor. Not usually very good. Most of the food that was going up with the astronauts was not very good, not just in flavor, but in texture, because it was either being cubed like this or dehydrated to the point of just being powder, much more than like a dehydrator that you'd have at home. And so, yes, they would add water and rehydrate it, but then it was just like mush. Astronaut Gordon Cooper was the first to try this space mush when he failed to enjoy a bag of roast beef. Though both the mush and the food cubes seem to have been preferred over the tubes of food that they had on those early missions. What I find really interesting is that the dehydrated food, it was much lighter, obviously, but they didn't need to take into account the weight of the water that would be used to hydrate it, because they didn't take the water with them into space, they made the water in space. Now, I'm not a rocket scientist, no, really, but I am led to believe that in those early spacecrafts, the fuel cells made electricity by mixing hydrogen and oxygen somehow, and that led to a byproduct of water, and it was that water that they would use to rehydrate the food, so they didn't have to count it and in the weight of the spacecraft going up. Ingenious. Now, when it came to taste, the act of dehydrating kind of took a lot of that out, I guess, and even worse, when they would rehydrate it, the astronauts often said that it kind of took on the flavor of the plastic bag that it was in, so it all just kind of tasted the same, none of which was good. More popular was the freeze-dried food, which they eventually started bringing on, and it didn't take out as much water content, so it kept more of the texture of the original food and more of the flavor. So those ended up becoming more popular, but they couldn't freeze-dry everything, I guess. A lot of things still had to be dehydrated. Now, they were testing all sorts of other ways to preserve food, and one of my favorites was actually done by Dr. Sidney Schwartz, who had made food for the Navy when they had gone down to Antarctica. But when it came to the space food, what he did was he worked out a recipe on paper and shopped in a Bethpage, New York supermarket for $5 worth of groceries: flour, cornstarch, powdered milk, banana flakes, and hominy grits. Now, had that been the full recipe, I would have just made that today. But it was the way that he actually prepared those ingredients that I just can't do at home. After mixing the ingredients, he baked them in a hydraulic press at 400 degrees Fahrenheit under 3,000 pounds of pressure. The result was a brick of food that he said was as hard as tempered masonite and would require a saw, an electric saw, to actually cut through. Essentially, he had made astronaut hardtack. And just like the sailors of yore, it had to be pulverized into a dust and then put into water and soaked for several hours before it even became palatable. But once it had, he said it tasted like breakfast cereal topped with bananas. I rather like it, though I don't think it ever actually made it up into space. But in 1964, the Los Angeles Times did tell us about some foods that were making it into space on the upcoming Gemini missions. And yes, it's pronounced Gemini. I always thought it was Gemini, like, the zodiac sign, but according to NASA in 1965, they said, nope, we pronounce it Gemini. I kind of think it was because some of the people working on it didn't know that it was pronounced Gemini, but they refused to admit that, and so it's Gemini. Anyway, the Los Angeles Times said, to eat, astronauts will sit strapped in chairs side by side with a water source between them. After inserting the nozzle in one end of a dehydrated food package, they'll wait for the food to be reconstituted and then eat from the other end of the bag. On the 2-week Gemini flight, astronauts will have a 2,500 calorie a day diet in 4 meals. The proposed menu for days 1, 5, 9, and 13 is Meal A: sugar frosted flakes, sausage patties, toast squares, and orange grapefruit juice. Meal B: tuna salad, cheese sandwiches, apricot pudding, and grape juice. Meal C: beef pot roast, carrots and cream sauce, toasted bread cubes, pineapple cubes, and tea. Meal D: potato soup, chicken bites, toast squares, applesauce, brownies, and grapefruit juice. So it was a good amount of food. The only issue was getting the astronauts to actually eat it. There were a lot of missions where they'd be sent up with 2,500 calorie a day meals, but they would only eat less than 1,000 calories. Part of this was because the taste was not great due to being in space. the fluids inside of their body would pool more in their head than usual because of very little gravity, and so they would kind of always have a stuffy nose, so it just made it so they couldn't taste anything really. The other issue was that the food sucked. The way that it was processed, the flavor was gone, it was mush, they just didn't like it. But there was a huge leap forward at Christmas of 1968. It was on Apollo 8, the first space flight to reach the moon, and on Christmas Day, the three-man crew, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, opened their food locker to find a surprise. It was a full Christmas dinner, still processed, but a full Christmas dinner wrapped up in foil and then decorated with red and green ribbons. It was a turkey and gravy dinner complete with cranberry, applesauce, grape drink, and coffee. And while it might not look like much, the astronauts did say it was some of the best food they'd ever had in space. And this was because the turkey and gravy specifically was not fully dehydrated or freeze-dried or made into a little cube, but was served in something new called a wet pack. And this let a lot of the moisture stay in the food, so not only did the flavor stay, but some of the texture too. This was done by a process called thermostabilization, which is essentially heating it to a temperature where it kills many of the microorganisms, similar to the way that you do canning. And this became a very new and popular way of making their food, but it seems that the food cubes and the dehydrated food stuck around because we know what they ate on the moon. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin spent a little less than 24 hours on the moon, during which time they'd eat 2 meals. Their first scheduled meal to be eaten on the moon will consist of bacon squares, peaches, sugar cookie cubes, pineapple grapefruit drink, and coffee. The second meal will contain beef stew, cream of chicken soup, date fruitcake, grape punch, and orange drink. And as I mentioned in my video on fruitcake, that fruitcake did not get eaten. They actually brought it back with them, and you can still see it at the Smithsonian today. Now, these meals were meant to be eaten inside of the lunar lander, but should they get peckish while they're out there bouncing around on the moon itself, well, they had these food bars that were stuck into the neck ring of their helmet, and they could like crane their neck and take a bite. I guess, though, that they didn't like this, and these stuck around all through NASA in the 60s and 70s, even into like spacewalks and stuff. They had these, but nobody really liked them because they would just get sticky and like get food all over your chin and everything. And it would be hours and hours before they could take the suit off and be back on the ship to clean it off. So usually what ended up happening was they would eat these bars before they even went out of the spacecraft, completely defeating the point of having them in the first place. Now, while American astronauts were eating all of these American foods, the Soviet cosmonauts were eating Soviet foods, foods that were popular in their neck of the woods. Things like Borodinsky brown bread, cabbage soup, sausages, and for one dinner on the Soyuz 9 in 1970, they had volba, smoked fish, karcho, spiced meat and rice soup, chicken or ham or meat pate, brown bread, prunes, and nuts. There was also an interesting incident when Viktor Patsayev turned 38 in space in 1971 after his fellow cosmonauts toasted to his health with tubes of prune paste. Vladislav Volkov presented me with an onion, and Georgy Dobrovolsky with a lemon. They had brought their presents from Earth and had kept silent about them, wanting to surprise me. I especially enjoyed the onion. Now, I find this a rather curious incident because what was he doing with that onion? Were they in paste form, or was it like an actual lemon and onion? And if it was an actual onion, was he just biting into it? I couldn't find an explanation. Now, going back to the Americans' food, the Apollo missions were the first to have hot water on board so they could finally have a somewhat warm meal. But the real leap in food temperature came in 1973 with America's first space station, Skylab. It had a lot more room inside than the earlier space capsules, so they could have something resembling a kitchen. They had a dedicated dining space, a heater that could warm meals, and even a refrigerator which allowed them to have dripless ice cream, which came in the form of frozen blue wafers that would melt when popped into the astronaut's mouth. What they did not have was what was marketed as astronaut ice cream. That was very popular in the 70s and 80s when I was a kid. It is delicious, but it never actually went into space. It was also on the spaceship in 1973 that the electrical engineer Owen Garriott played a bit of a practical joke on Mission Control back down on Earth by sneaking aboard a tape recording of his wife's voice. See, Mission Control could only hear what was going on in the spacecraft, and all of a sudden, they heard Helen's voice. "This is Helen in Skylab. The boys hadn't had a home-cooked meal in so long, I thought I'd just bring one up." Though my favorite space food practical joke definitely comes from the Soviets, though it was when the Soviets and Americans met up for the first time in space, and so it was, they were on the phone with the president, and it was being televised. It was a big come-together moment. And then one of the cosmonauts, Alexei Leonov, he offers the two astronauts, the Americans, tubes that said vodka on them, and it was like some of the best vodka from Russia. And they were like, no, we can't do that. That's against the rules. Well, especially with the cameras here, we can't do that. And the Russians were like, come on, we have to toast to this. It's a Russian tradition. You gotta have some. Well, not wanting to start an international incident, one of the Americans takes a drink and realizes, it's not vodka, it's borscht. Leonov had just switched the labels. Now, vodka did eventually make it into space, but it wasn't until 1995, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when some of the rules became a little bit more lax, and they let vodka and cognac go up to the space station Mir. This allowed cosmonaut Valery Polyakov to take a shot to celebrate staying a record 437 days in space. Now, by this period, food in space had completely changed, and you look at videos from the 90s and the early thousands, and you see astronauts and cosmonauts at the different space stations eating everything from M&Ms to fresh fruit, pizza, granola bars. I'm sure they weren't Nature Valley granola bars because, the crumbs.
They'll clog the instruments!
There are still freeze-dried and some dehydrated foods and stuff, but the days of food paste squeezed from a tube, I believe those had come to an end. But as late as 2008, according to NASA, they were still sending up at least a little bit of Tang with different missions. But it was always in crystal form, never in pie form like I'm about to eat right now. And here we are, Tang pie from the 1960s. I am glad that it's not as unbelievably bright orange as the Tang was originally. With adding in the Cool Whip and everything kind of mellows it out and makes it look not so bad. I'm going to try to get some of the crust here and everything. It's very, very soft. Mine has been in the refrigerator now for at least, 12 hours or more. Still very soft. Let's give it a try. Tang. All right, so I know why they call it Tang. That is tangy. That has some zing to it, some zip. I don't like that flavor at all. But I don't really like sour things. If you do like sour things, you actually might like this. What it kind of reminds me of is a sweet version, or a very sweet like lemon meringue or key lime pie. But I don't really like that. It's just too sour for me. It just tastes like Tang and sugar, because that's kind of all it is. What I am pleasantly surprised about is the texture, because when I first mixed it all together, I took a little taste and it was super gritty because the Tang flavor crystals hadn't like dissolved, but they are all dissolved. Now it's super smooth. I think if I was a kid who liked sour things, I would actually really, really like this. But as an adult who doesn't like sour things, it's not for me. But it might be for you. If you like key lime pie, maybe this is worth giving a shot. It's a lot easier. So have some space food. Join me next week for the wrap-up of Transportation Month here on Tasting History, and I will see you next week, hopefully, on Tasting History.